Captain Sarah Mitchell had been flying helicopters for the United States Army for 15 years, and tonight felt different in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She stood in the pre-dawn darkness of the airfield, watching her crew perform their final checks on the Black Hawk helicopter, the massive aircraft looming before her like a sleeping predator. The cold cut through her flight jacket, and she pulled it tighter around her shoulders, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Behind her, the operations center blazed with light, windows glowing against the darkness like a ship navigating through an endless black sea. Inside those rooms, people were preparing for one of the most dangerous operations this forward base had attempted in months. The mission briefing still echoed in her mind, replaying on loop like a song she couldn't escape. Extract a deep reconnaissance team from hostile territory in the Paksha province. A seemingly straightforward operation on paper, but Sarah had been flying long enough to know that simplicity in planning rarely translated to simplicity in execution. Intelligence reports suggested the area was moderately dangerous, nothing suggesting the hornet's nest they might actually be walking into. But that was always the way with intelligence. It painted pictures with incomplete palettes. What burned most vividly in her memory were the senior commander's parting words. Colonel James Harrison, a man with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen too much, had pulled her aside after the main briefing concluded. 320 Rangers would deploy tonight, he'd explained, and they needed multiple extraction assets standing by. Sarah would be the backup pilot, the reserve, the contingency. And then came the words that had been gnawing at her all evening. No unauthorized flights. Once those birds launch, the sky belongs to dispatch alone. I don't want anyone making heroic decisions tonight. I want everyone following protocol. Are we clear, Captain? She'd nodded, understanding the gravity in his tone. Protocol kept people alive. Protocol was the skeleton that held chaos at bay. And protocol made sense when you considered the bigger picture. Unauthorized flights could create confusion, could put additional aircraft in danger, could lead to friendly fire incidents. She understood all of this intellectually. Her 15 years of service had hammered these lessons deep into her bones. But understanding and accepting were different animals entirely. Sarah shifted her weight, watching Master Sergeant Tom Davidson crawl beneath the fuselage, performing the final hydraulic checks. Tom had been with her for 7 years, and they moved together with the comfortable synchronization of a long partnership. He knew every quirk of this particular aircraft, every rattle and groan. He could diagnose problems by sound alone, a skill Sarah had always found almost supernatural. Behind him, Specialist Marcus Reeves checked the ammunition storage, moving with methodical precision. These were good men. These were men she trusted with her life, and more importantly, men who trusted her with theirs. The briefing had provided her with the route the Rangers would take. She'd studied it obsessively, memorizing every mountain pass, every possible landing zone, every escape route. 15 years of experience had taught her that knowledge was the greatest weapon in a pilot's arsenal. You couldn't control weather or enemy fire, but you could control your preparation. You could know your terrain so intimately that your hands could fly it in your sleep. She'd spent the last 3 hours tracing those routes on maps, her finger following the pathways like she was painting them onto her own mind. Inside the operations center, she'd seen the faces of the Rangers being briefed for the mission. Young faces, mostly. Strong faces. The kind of faces that looked invincible until you'd seen enough of them broken. She recognized several of them. Captain James Rodriguez, a man with a laugh that could fill a room, who'd flown with her 6 months ago on a milk run that had somehow become exciting when their helicopter's engine began making sounds it shouldn't make. Sarah had brought them home safe that day, and Rodriguez had bought her coffee and thanked her like she'd saved his life, even though all she'd done was her job. Private Marcus Chen, barely 23 years old, with a photograph of a newborn daughter tucked into his jacket pocket. Sarah had seen the photo once. The baby was beautiful, with her father's distinctive nose. Chen talked about her constantly, about getting home to meet her properly, about being the father he'd never had. There were others too, faces that had become familiar through months of seeing them around the base. Men who joked with her in the mess hall, who asked about her aircraft with genuine curiosity, who treated her with the kind of respect that came from understanding that her job was as dangerous as theirs, just in different ways. These were men she'd come to care about, even though 15 years of military service had taught her that caring too much was a liability. Sarah checked her watch. 1947 hours. The pre-dawn briefing was scheduled for 2000. The first wave would launch at 2100. She still had time to grab coffee, maybe force down something that resembled food, though her stomach felt like a clenched fist these days. The anticipation before major operations always hit her like this, a certain tightness in her chest, a restlessness that made sitting still feel impossible. She walked back toward the operations center, her boots crunching on the frozen ground. The desert night was cold, far colder than the daytime temperatures suggested it would become. She thought about the Rangers, about Rodriguez and Chen and all the others heading into uncertainty. They were volunteers, every one of them. They'd chosen this life, chosen this danger, but choice didn't make it less real when bullets started flying. Inside the operations center, the energy was controlled but electric. Officers moved with purpose, checking and rechecking systems, running through contingencies. General Thomas Morrison stood near the main display, his arms crossed, his expression carved from stone. He was the commanding general, and the weight of 320 lives rested on his shoulders. Sarah wondered if he slept the night before operations like these. She wondered if any of them truly slept. The lead pilot for the first wave, Major David Chambers, was running through his pre-flight checklist with the kind of focus that suggested nothing else existed in the world. Sarah had flown with Chambers before. He was good, steady, experienced, reliable. The kind of pilot you wanted carrying your people into danger. That should have been comforting. Instead, it made her feel like something was wrong, like her instincts were warning her about something her conscious mind hadn't yet recognized. The sun refused to rise, and the temperature continued to drop. Sarah felt an inexplicable tension in her chest, the kind of feeling that comes from some deep, ancient part of human consciousness that still remembers how to recognize danger. Something whispered that tonight would test more than just her flying skills. Something told her that Colonel Harrison's warnings about protocol and unauthorized flights were hints at what her own instincts were already screaming. She gripped the edge of the operations table, her knuckles whitening, and waited for 2100 hours to arrive. The final minutes before launch stretched like taffy, bending time into something unrecognizable. Sarah stood in the ready room, watching the Rangers conduct their final preparations. They moved with the precision of men who had performed this ritual 1,000 times before, each motion purposeful and practiced. Equipment was checked, weapons secured, magazines loaded. Everything was ready. Everything except the indefinable feeling in Sarah's gut that refused to settle. The morning was beginning its slow transition from the deep black of night toward the gray of pre-dawn. In another hour, the sun would crack the horizon, and the desert would transform from cold mystery into brutal visibility. But for now, they existed in that liminal space between darkness and light, in a zone where anything seemed possible. Sarah watched Captain James Rodriguez move through the crowd of Rangers, checking on his men, offering quiet words of encouragement. His movements were calm, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched slightly when he thought no one was watching. Rodriguez had always been the kind of officer who carried the weight of his soldiers' lives visibly. He wasn't one of those commanders who could compartmentalize fear or doubt. Instead, he seemed to embrace it, to acknowledge it, and then move forward anyway. Sarah had always found that quality admirable. It took more courage to be afraid and act anyway than to simply suppress fear through willpower or denial. Private Marcus Chen sat on a bench, meticulously checking his rifle for what must have been the 5th time in the last 10 minutes. His hands moved with ritualistic precision, charging handle back and locked, chamber clear, safety on. the muscle memory of training taking over where conscious thought had begun to falter. Sarah could see the photograph tucked into his jacket pocket. She wondered if his newborn daughter knew what her father did for a living. She wondered if Chen thought about her now, in these final minutes before stepping into danger. The helicopter crews were already mobilized, performing their own pre-flights with the same ritualistic precision. Sarah watched from her vantage point as Major Chambers conducted his exterior walk-around on the lead Black Hawk. He moved like a man performing a sacred ceremony, his hands checking each surface, each rivet, each connection point. Nothing escaped his attention. Sarah had done that same walk-around 1,000 times, and she recognized the meditative quality it provided. It was a way to transition from normal life to the heightened awareness required to pilot a helicopter in a combat zone. The operations center was a hive of controlled activity. General Morrison stood before the main display, studying the map of the insertion zone with the intensity of a chess player contemplating his next move. Sarah could see the markers indicating the suspected enemy positions, red dots scattered across the terrain like blood drops on white paper. Intelligence had provided their best estimates, but estimates were educated guesses, and educated guesses had a habit of being spectacularly wrong when bullets started flying. Colonel Harrison appeared in the doorway, his presence commanding immediate attention. He surveyed the room with eyes that seemed to catalog every detail, every person, every potential problem. When he spotted Sarah, he nodded slightly. It wasn't a particularly warm acknowledgement, but it was recognition. It was understanding. She wondered if he was thinking about the conversation they'd had earlier about protocol and authorization and the fine line between heroism and recklessness. The first briefing concluded at 20:45 hours. Rangers gathered in tight clusters, receiving final instructions. Sarah listened from her position at the edge of the room, absorbing every detail. The operation would proceed in 3 waves. The first wave, carrying 120 Rangers led by Rodriguez, would insert at the primary landing zone. They would establish a perimeter and secure the area. The second wave, carrying an additional 120 Rangers, would follow 30 minutes later, expanding the secured zone. The final wave would carry support elements, medical personnel, and additional firepower. The entire operation was calculated to take approximately 45 minutes from first landing to complete establishment of the operational area. Everything was predicated on the insertion zone being lightly defended, possibly even abandoned. Intelligence suggested the area was used intermittently by opposition forces, but nothing indicated they expected American activity. That assumption was the foundation upon which the entire operation was built. Sarah had learned long ago that assumptions were frequently wrong. She wondered if the intelligence analysts who had developed this assessment had ever been on the ground when an assumption proved false. At 2100 hours, the first wave began its march to the helicopters. Sarah watched from the operations center as Rodriguez led his Rangers toward the aircraft, their equipment creating a symphony of clinks and clanks. Ammunition, grenades, radios, water containers, medical supplies. Each Ranger carried approximately 70 pounds of equipment, and they moved under that weight with the acceptance of men who had trained with it until it became an extension of their bodies. Rodriguez paused at the entrance to the first helicopter, turning to look back at his men. Sarah saw something pass across his face, a moment of vulnerability, quickly masked. It was the expression of a man carrying 320 lives on his shoulders, wondering if he would bring them all home intact. He turned and disappeared into the aircraft. Chen moved toward the second helicopter in the wave, his rifle held at port arms, his movements efficient. As he passed beneath the rotor blades, he looked up, his eyes finding the sky. Sarah wondered what he was thinking. Was he thinking about his daughter? Was he thinking about coming home? Was he thinking about the possibility that he might not come home at all? The 3 Black Hawks for the first wave began their engines simultaneously. The sound was distinctive, a mechanical growl that rose in pitch and intensity as the rotors engaged. The aircraft shuddered as the rotors spun up to operating speed, their blades biting the pre-dawn air. Sarah felt the vibration through the floor of the operations center. She always felt helicopters starting up, felt them in her bones, in her chest, in her instincts. At 21:07 hours, the first wave lifted off. The three Black Hawks rose from the tarmac like ancient beasts stirring from sleep. Sarah watched them climb, banking toward the north, their silhouettes becoming smaller against the dark sky until they merged with the darkness itself and disappeared. Only the radio chatter confirmed they still existed, radio chatter confirming their progress northward, their climb to proper altitude, their course toward destiny. "All birds airborne," the lead pilot's voice crackled through the speakers. "First wave heading to primary LZ. Estimated time to insertion, 18 minutes. Sarah watched the radar blip that represented her friends, her colleagues, the 320 Rangers who had just launched toward uncertainty. She could see the blips moving steadily across the screen, creating a track that would lead them into danger. The operations center settled into a waiting rhythm, everyone watching, everyone listening, everyone aware that the true test was just beginning. Sarah returned to the observation window and stared out at the empty tarmac. The remaining helicopters sat silent and ready, their crews maintaining vigilant watch. She was back up now, grounded back up, waiting. The feeling in her chest had not improved. If anything, it had intensified, a pressure building behind her ribs like a storm front approaching from distant mountains. She placed her palm against the cool glass of the window and waited for the radio to bring news of what was happening in the darkness above the desert. The first indication that something was wrong came through the radio at 21:28 hours, exactly 21 minutes after the lead helicopter crossed the insertion zone perimeter. It was not a dramatic announcement. It was not a desperate cry for help. It was simply a brief, almost conversational statement that would later be analyzed and reanalyzed 1,000 times. "Command, we've got movement to the south. Looks like multiple personnel." The voice belonged to the lead helicopter's crew chief, and it carried the neutral tone of a man reporting something noteworthy but not necessarily alarming. That tone would change in the next 90 seconds. Sarah was standing near the communications console when she heard those words. She turned toward the speaker, her entire body going rigid. She'd been an Army pilot long enough to know that multiple personnel in hostile territory meant one of two things, either nothing or everything. The next voice to crackle through was Rodriguez, measured but alert. "All elements stay sharp. Perimeter security on high alert." The Rangers had trained for enemy contact. They had scenarios drilled into their muscle memory, but training and reality had a way of diverging in critical moments. The next radio transmission came 45 seconds later and everything changed. "Contact, contact. We've got muzzle flashes from the Ridgeline Eastern approach, taking rounds." The voice was still Rodriguez, but the careful control had fractured. Beneath it, Sarah could hear the underlying current of urgency, the sudden shift from preparation to combat. The operations center erupted. General Morrison moved forward, his hands braced on the edge of the communications console. Colonel Harrison's jaw tightened visibly. Officers began moving with increased purpose, cross-checking systems, pulling up contingency protocols. The red markers on the display, the estimated enemy positions, suddenly felt very different now that they were firing actual weapons at actual Americans. Sarah found her hands gripping the edge of the table so hard her fingernails bit crescents into her palms. "All aircraft maintain altitude," came the command from air operations. "Ground units assess situation." It was the right call, the textbook response. Hold position while gathering intelligence. Don't commit additional forces until you understand what you're facing. But the radio chatter was becoming faster now, more fragmented, the kind of communication that happened when adrenaline overrode training. "They've got us covered from multiple positions. We're taking effective fire." This voice was younger, strained. Sarah recognized it as belonging to Second Lieutenant Michael Torres, Rodriguez's second in command. "We need suppressive fire from the aircraft. We're pinned." "We've got RPG," another voice screamed. "Incoming RPG." The sound of an explosion, even transmitted through radio, was unmistakable, a low, gut-punch boom that suggested something large and violent had just occurred. Sarah's vision seemed to tunnel. The operations center continued its controlled chaos around her, but she was fixated on the speaker, on the radio display, on the digital representation of 3 helicopters hovering above a suddenly very active combat zone. 30 seconds ago, this had been a routine insertion. Now it was an active firefight, and the ground forces were taking fire from multiple positions simultaneously. "We need air support now." Rodriguez's voice cut through the radio chatter like a blade. There was something in his tone that made Sarah's chest constrict, not panic, but the controlled desperation of a commander who had suddenly discovered that his intelligence was dramatically wrong. "There are more enemy fighters here than expected. We estimate 20 to 30 opposition personnel, possibly more in the surrounding terrain." Colonel Harrison was on the radio immediately. "What's your ammunition situation?" "We can sustain for now, but not indefinitely," Rodriguez responded. "We're taking fire from at least 3 positions. We need to establish better cover and suppress enemy movement." The situation deteriorated in real time. Another explosion, definitely an RPG. One of the Rangers screaming something unintelligible. Torres reporting that the eastern perimeter was receiving intense machine gun fire. The pilots of the circling helicopters requesting permission to engage with door guns, and Colonel Harrison granting it with the kind of reluctance that suggested he was acutely aware that authorizing additional firepower would only further escalate the situation. Then came the words that seemed to drain the oxygen from the operations center. "We've got wounded. 2 soldiers down." "Status?" demanded General Morrison, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Private First Class Daniel Morrison and Specialist Sarah Wu," Rodriguez reported, and Sarah's heart dropped. She knew both of those names. Morrison was a quiet kid from Kentucky, always smiling. Wu was sharp as a tack, one of the most technically proficient soldiers she'd encountered. Morrison is mobile but bleeding heavily. Wu is non-responsive. We're moving them to the compound center for medical treatment. The radio chatter accelerated further. The door gunners from the circling helicopters engaging targets, expending ammunition in tight, disciplined bursts. The Rangers returning fire, the sharp crack of small arms fire audible even through the radio transmissions. Another explosion. Torres reporting that a section of the perimeter wall had been damaged by RPG fire. Rodriguez reporting casualties beyond the 2 already mentioned. Soldiers with minor wounds. Soldiers with serious wounds. Soldiers whose status was unknown because the firefight was too intense to conduct a proper assessment. Sarah's hands were shaking. She clenched them into fists, trying to control the tremors. Rodriguez was down there. Chen was down there. All 320 Rangers were scattered across multiple landing zones, and at least some of them were engaged in intense combat with a much larger and better prepared enemy force than anyone had anticipated. "Medical evacuation requested," Rodriguez's voice came through, steady but tight. "We have 2 priority wounded and potentially a 3rd. Private Morrison is stable but will deteriorate without immediate medical attention. Specialist Wu is critical. We need extraction." "Understood," replied the air operations officer. "Stand by for extraction guidance." But there was no extraction guidance coming. That was the moment Sarah understood, with absolute certainty, what was about to happen. Protocol dictated that extraction helicopter assets would hold position until the ground situation stabilized. Protocol said that sending additional helicopters into an active combat zone would only complicate an already dangerous situation. Protocol made perfect sense when viewed from the safety of the operations center. Protocol made no sense when you were bleeding out beneath a foreign sky. Sarah watched General Morrison and Colonel Harrison exchange glances. She saw the weight of command pressing down on them both, the awful recognition that every decision they made had life-or-death consequences. The firefight continued unabated, more ammunition being expended, more Rangers taking fire from positions that seemed to multiply even as they were being suppressed. "Command!" Rodriguez's voice came again, and this time there was something different in it, a question, a plea masked as a professional military request. How long until extraction assets become available? The silence that followed was perhaps the most terrifying sound Sarah had heard all night. It stretched for 3 seconds, then 5. Finally, Colonel Harrison responded, "Hold position. We're assessing extraction options." Hold position. The words that meant wait. The words that meant endure. The words that meant 320 Rangers would continue to fight, continue to bleed, and continue to hope that help would arrive before the ambush became a massacre. Time moved differently in combat situations. Sarah had learned this years ago, but understanding it intellectually and experiencing it were entirely different things. What should have been seconds felt like minutes. What should have been minutes stretched into eternities. The clock on the operations center wall read 21:34 hours, but to everyone watching that digital display, it might as well have been frozen in place. The firefight had been ongoing for approximately 6 minutes. 6 minutes. To someone in an office who had never experienced combat, 6 minutes might seem manageable. To someone in the operations center watching their people die in real time on the other end of a radio transmission, 6 minutes felt like an apocalypse condensed into an impossible time frame. Ammunition status. Colonel Harrison's voice was controlled, but Sarah could hear the fracture lines in it now, the places where command authority was beginning to crack under pressure. 60% on ammunition, Rodriguez reported. His breathing was heavier now, and there was the sound of chaos behind his voice, weapons firing, men shouting, the mechanical sound of spent brass casings hitting stone. "We're conserving rounds, but we're suppressing 3 active fire positions simultaneously. We can't stop engaging without giving them the opportunity to assault our position." That was the trap. That was the reason hold position made sense in theory but failed catastrophically in practice. The Rangers couldn't retreat. They were pinned. They couldn't advance. They were outnumbered. They could only maintain suppressive fire and hope that someone somewhere would send them help before ammunition ran out or their position was overrun. Sarah watched General Morrison move to the communications console, his body language suggesting a man carrying the weight of impossible decisions. "How many opposition fighters are we looking at?" he asked quietly. "Best estimate is 30 to 40, Rodriguez responded. "They're coordinated. This isn't random fire. They knew we were coming, sir. This is an ambush." The implications hung in the air like a held breath. Intelligence had been wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but catastrophically, fundamentally wrong. And 320 Americans were paying the price for that intelligence failure in blood and ammunition. "Status on the wounded," General Morrison continued, his tone becoming even quieter, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Private Morrison's bleeding is controlled, but he's going into shock," came the medical officer's voice. Captain Linda Hayes, a trauma surgeon who had seen more combat wounds in the last year than most physicians saw in a lifetime. "I need him out of here within the hour or he's going to die. Specialist Wu is critical. She's lost a lot of blood, and I don't have the equipment here to address the internal bleeding I suspect she's experiencing." 1 hour. Sarah fixed on those words. 1 hour before a young man from Kentucky would die if he didn't receive proper medical care. 1 hour before Specialist Wu's odds of survival dropped to near zero. Colonel Harrison turned away from the communications console and faced General Morrison. Sarah could read the conflict in his body language. A man who understood protocol, who believed in the structure and discipline that protocol provided, but who was beginning to recognize that protocol had been designed for situations that didn't include, All 3 wounded soldiers will be dead within 60 minutes. Sir, Colonel Harrison said quietly, we need to authorize extraction and risk another 3 helicopters in an active combat zone where we have no idea of the actual threat level. General Morrison's voice was steady, but the question contained multitudes. It contained the weight of 320 Rangers. It contained the responsibility of command. It contained the awful mathematics of military decision-making, where you had to calculate how many people might die in an extraction attempt against how many would die without one. All respect, sir, Colonel Harrison continued. Our people are dying down there. We have a medical window that's closing fast. I understand the situation, Colonel. There was something final in General Morrison's tone, the sound of a man making the worst decision of his command. But we hold position. We assess options. We don't send more people to die because of intelligence failure. Sarah felt something snap inside her chest. She'd held it together through the initial reports, through the escalating violence, through the realization that Rodriguez and Chen and all the others were in mortal danger. But watching General Morrison make the choice to do nothing, watching Colonel Harrison accept that choice even as he disagreed with it, watching the clock advance 1 more minute while Rangers bled out in the Afghan night, something inside her simply broke. Back at the helicopters, the situation was taking on a surreal quality. The standby crews maintained their positions, their aircraft pre-flighted and ready, waiting for the authorization that continued not to come. Sarah's crew chief, Tom Davidson, kept checking and rechecking systems, his movements becoming more agitated as the minutes stretched. Sarah could see him through the operations center window, could read the frustration in the set of his shoulders. The radio traffic continued, each transmission painting a more desperate picture. TORs reporting that they were holding the perimeter, but just barely. Rangers reporting ammunition, reserves dwindling. The circling helicopters reporting that they were expending ammunition at a rate that would become unsustainable if the situation continued. Captain Hayes reporting that Private Morrison's condition was deteriorating despite her best efforts. The sounds of explosions, gunfire, shouted orders creating a cacophony of combat that seemed to mock the careful deliberation happening in the operations center. Then came Rodriguez's voice, and something had changed in it. Not panic, not quite desperation, but something close to resignation, the sound of a commander beginning to accept that his options had narrowed to only terrible choices. Command, we're down to 40% ammunition. If this continues for another 5 to 10 minutes, we're going to reach the point where we can't maintain suppressive fire. Understood, General Morrison responded, and his voice was quieter than before. Continue to engage targets and maintain position. Sir, Rodriguez said, and there was a question in his voice now, a plea masked as a professional query. If we lose suppressive fire capability, what happens? No one answered. Everyone in the operations center understood what would happen. With suppressive fire down, the opposition fighters would assault the position. With a depleted ammunition supply, the Rangers wouldn't be able to mount an effective defense. What had been a desperate but manageable situation would transform into a slaughter. Sarah could see the realization spreading through the operations center like a contagion. They all understood now. They all comprehended what holding position actually meant. It meant watching 320 people die, because protocol had been designed for situations where all sides behaved predictably, where intelligence was reliable, where the rules of engagement remained within calculated parameters. The clock read 21:41 hours, 7 minutes of combat. The medical window on Private Morrison had narrowed to 53 minutes. Specialist Wu had perhaps even less time, and the ammunition reserve on the ground was depleting at a rate that would result in zero suppressive fire capability within 10 minutes if the current engagement rate continued. Sarah stood in the operations center and watched her friends prepare to die, and she made a decision that would change everything. Sarah Mitchell walked away from the communications console at 21:42 hours without a word. No explanation, no announcement, no protocol. She simply turned and walked, her boots carrying her through the operations center with the kind of purpose that made people unconsciously step aside. She could feel the weight of command behind her, could sense the operations officers tracking her movement with confusion, but she didn't look back. If she looked back, she would see the faces of men who were making terrible decisions based on protocol. She would see the resignation in their expressions. She would see the acceptance of the unacceptable, so she didn't look back. The cold night air hit her face as she exited the operations center, and it felt like a physical thing, a reminder that the world outside those walls still existed, still moved, still offered possibilities beyond protocol and procedure. Her helicopter sat on the tarmac, silhouetted against the darkness, its rotors hanging motionless like exhausted limbs. She could see Tom Davidson moving around the aircraft, performing checks that didn't need to be performed, his movements becoming more agitated as the minutes accumulated and no authorization came. Sarah headed directly toward the Black Hawk, her pace steady, her mind crystallizing around a single point. This would end. Master Sergeant Tom Davidson saw her coming and straightened, his expression shifting from frustration to confusion. "Captain," he called out, reading something in her body language that told him this was more than a routine check. "What's happening?" "Pre-flight verification," Sarah said, her voice steady in a way that contradicted the chaos happening behind her ribs. "Instrument calibration check. Need to verify the navigation systems are functioning properly before we're needed." Tom studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah watched understanding bloom across his weathered features. He'd been in the Army long enough to recognize when someone was walking the line between following orders and skirting them with technical accuracy. Instrument checks were indeed part of standard readiness protocol. If a pilot wanted to run a full systems verification, it wasn't directly violating orders. It was protocol operating in a gray zone, the kind of zone where desperate people found justification for desperate actions. "Understood, Captain," Tom said quietly, and he moved toward the helicopter. "I'll run through the full checklist." Behind Tom, the other crew members moved into action, Specialist Marcus Reeves checking the ammunition loadout, confirming that every seat had security webbing intact, that every system was operational. They understood. Somehow, without explicit communication, her crew understood what was happening and why. These were men who had flown with her long enough to recognize when the weight of command had finally become unbearable. Sarah moved to the pilot's seat and ran through her own pre-flight with methodical precision. Everything had to be perfect. If she was going to do this, if she was truly going to walk this line between protocol and mutiny, the aircraft had to be flawless. She checked fuel levels, full capacity. She verified avionics, all systems green. She confirmed weapons systems, communication arrays, hydraulic pressures, electrical systems. Every single system checked out perfectly, which somehow felt like confirmation that what she was about to do was meant to happen. The radio crackled in the background of her consciousness, and she could hear Rodriguez's voice becoming quieter, more controlled, the way a man's voice becomes when he's accepted the inevitability of death. "Command, we're at 30% ammunition. We're going to need to consolidate positions if we want to maintain suppressive fire." 30%. The countdown was accelerating. Sarah's hands moved through the pre-flight sequence with practiced efficiency, but her mind was traveling down a different path, one that led away from protocol and into something far more dangerous. She was thinking about Rodriguez. She was thinking about Chen. She was thinking about the photograph of a newborn daughter who would grow up without a father because protocol had mattered more than lives. "All systems green," Tom reported from outside. "She's ready, Captain. Full operational capability." Sarah took a deep breath. This was the moment. This was the point where she could turn back, could walk away, could accept that this situation was beyond her control, and her responsibility ended at the edge of authority. This was the moment where she could preserve her career, preserve her safety, preserve her life by accepting that command had made its decision and she had to live with it. She thought about Rodriguez's voice asking what would happen if they lost suppressive fire capability. She thought about Specialist Wu bleeding internally with no way to stop it. She thought about Private Morrison going into shock, his mortality measured in minutes. She reached for the radio and keyed it. "Operations, Black Hawk 5, she said, her voice steady and professional. "Running full systems diagnostic on navigation instrumentation. I'm noting some variance in the terrain following radar calibration that needs verification. Requesting clearance to conduct instrument verification, flight at altitude to test systems in actual operational parameters." There was a pause, a heartbeat, then another. Sarah could imagine the communications officer checking the protocol manual, finding that yes, instrument verification flights were indeed a valid operational requirement. Pilots could request them if there was concern about system accuracy. It was technically authorized. It was protocol compliant. It was also the thinnest possible excuse for doing exactly what Colonel Harrison had ordered her not to do. "Black Hawk 5, you're cleared for instrument verification flight," came the response, and Sarah heard the confusion in the operator's voice. This was unusual, but it wasn't forbidden. "Maintain contact and report any findings." "Copy that, operations," Sarah responded. "Black Hawk 5 beginning startup sequence." She moved her hands to the controls and the familiar pre-start sequence began. The engines responded, the hydraulic systems pressurized, the rotors began their spin-up. Sarah felt the aircraft come alive around her, felt it transition from inert machine to living thing. This was what she understood. This was what she could control. Not protocol, not command decisions, not the mathematics of acceptable losses. But this, the machine, the sky, the ability to move through space and time and place herself where she was needed. The rotor blades reached operating speed. The aircraft shuddered as it prepared for flight. "Black Hawk 5 beginning takeoff," Sarah reported. "Black Hawk 5, you are cleared for," the operator began, but Sarah was already pulling up on the collective. The aircraft rose, its nose dipping slightly as it transitioned from vertical lift to forward motion. Behind her, Tom secured the interior, his movements suggesting he understood completely what was about to happen. The operations center would be in chaos now. Colonel Harrison would realize that her instrument verification flight was taking her directly toward the engagement zone. But by the time they issued a recall order, she would be committed. By the time they radioed frantically for her to return to base, she would be too far out to convince, too deep in the mission parameters to justify turning back. Sarah pushed the helicopter faster, climbing toward altitude, her course carrying her north toward the mountains where 320 Rangers were being systematically destroyed by a situation that protocol had deemed acceptable. She had made her choice. There was no going back now. The radio exploded with activity the moment Sarah's Black Hawk committed to forward flight. "Black Hawk 5, return to base immediately." Colonel Harrison's voice crackled through with an authority that tried and failed to mask panic. "That's a direct order, Captain Mitchell." Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls. She didn't respond. Responding would have meant engaging in a dialogue that she couldn't win, meant having to defend a choice that needed no defense, meant breaking her concentration at a moment when concentration was the only thing keeping her alive. The helicopter climbed steadily, banking northward, the desert floor dropping away beneath her as altitude increased. "Captain Mitchell, acknowledge." This was General Morrison now, his voice carrying the weight of command, the authority of superior officers, the force of military hierarchy that had governed every day of her 15-year career. "You are in violation of direct orders. Return to base immediately or face court-martial." She keyed the radio. "Operations, Black Hawk 5 is proceeding with instrument verification flight as authorized. Navigation systems require altitude testing in actual operational environment. Estimated flight time 10 minutes. It was a calculated deception, the kind that fell into the gray zone between truth and lie. She was at altitude. She was in an operational environment, and she had been authorized for an instrument verification flight. What she hadn't mentioned was that her route to verify instruments was taking her directly to the combat zone. The helicopter pushed northward, and Sarah gradually increased speed beyond recommended parameters. The Black Hawk was capable of higher velocities than the manual recommended for normal operations, and right now, normal operations were a luxury she couldn't afford. The aircraft shuddered slightly as she pushed the envelope, the engine straining as she demanded more power from systems designed for sustainable use, not maximum effort. Behind her, Tom Davidson was monitoring systems, watching gauges that were beginning to reflect the stress Sarah was placing on the aircraft. He said nothing. There was nothing to say. They were committed now, past the point where turning back would save her career or her life. The only option remaining was to drive forward and make this gamble matter. The desert below was a landscape of darkness and shadow, broken intermittently by the lights of scattered villages and the occasional vehicle moving along a road. But ahead in the distance, Sarah could see something that made her jaw tighten. The faint glow of tracer fire, the distinctive red and green arcs of bullets streaming across the night sky in a deadly geometry. Her Rangers were still fighting, still bleeding, still alive. "All aircraft Black Hawk 5 is inbound to the LZ," she transmitted, using the terminology that made it sound almost routine. "ETA 5 minutes. Black Hawk 5 negative." Operations responded immediately, but the authorization had already been given, the flight already committed, and Sarah was already past the point where she could plausibly turn back. "You are not cleared to approach the LZ." Sarah didn't respond. Silence on the radio was a form of rebellion, a way of refusing to engage with authority she could no longer acknowledge. She pushed the helicopter harder, watching the airspeed indicator climb to velocities that were definitely not recommended for normal operations. The ground fire became visible now, tracer rounds arcing upward like jealous fingers trying to pull her from the sky. The opposition fighters had seen her helicopter. They knew an extraction attempt was underway. They were shifting fire, redirecting their weapons toward the new threat approaching their position. "Incoming fire," Tom shouted from the side door. 1 o'clock, 2 rounds contact." The helicopter shuddered as a round punched through the fuselage near the cargo door. Sarah heard the sound, a sharp, metallic crack that seemed impossibly loud despite the roar of the engines. Her door gunner, Sergeant Rivera, was already in position, his machine gun coming to life with a focused intensity that transformed the chaos into purposeful violence. The gun hammered, expending ammunition in disciplined bursts, suppressing the opposition fighters who were trying to bring her down. "Taking fire, starboard side," another voice called out. More rounds coming now, a coordinated effort from multiple positions to eliminate this unexpected threat. Sarah banked hard, using the terrain to shield the aircraft, pushing the Black Hawk's capabilities to the absolute limit. The helicopter responded, banking at angles that should have caused structural failure, but held because Sarah was flying with the kind of desperation that transcended normal operational parameters. Another round caught the aircraft, this one impacting near the left engine. The engine warning light flickered, and for a moment that stretched into infinity, Sarah thought it was over, thought the helicopter would lose power, thought she would fall from the sky with 3 of her crew aboard, thought her gamble would transform from heroism into tragedy. The engine held. The warning light flickered and went dark. The engine continued to function, damaged but operational, exactly what she needed from it in this moment. "Engine 1 is damaged but functional," Tom reported, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Continuing to climb." The Rangers on the ground heard the helicopter. Sarah could hear it in the sudden shift in radio traffic, the explosion of hope that manifested in Rodriguez's voice. "We've got air support. Contact. We've got a Black Hawk inbound. All positions, suppress enemy fire." Torres was shouting, his voice carrying the kind of energy that came from believing rescue was actually possible. The Rangers shifted their suppressive fire pattern, now coordinating with the helicopter's approach, creating overlapping fields of fire that kept the opposition fighters pinned and ineffective. Sarah descended toward the LZ, her approach taking her directly through the enemy's field of fire. Tracer rounds continued to arc upward, some passing so close that she could almost feel the heat. The helicopter danced through the fire like something alive, something determined, something that refused to be brought down. Rodriguez was on the radio now. "Black Hawk 5, we have 2 critical wounded and several minor injuries. We can have personnel ready for immediate extraction. Your approach vector is clear. We're suppressing north and east positions. You are cleared hot for the landing zone." "Copy that," Sarah transmitted, and she pushed the helicopter into final approach. The landing zone was a small compound surrounded by stone walls, with the Rangers positioned defensively at every corner. She could see them now, could see the muzzle flashes of their weapons, could see the intensity of their defensive posture. She began her descent into the killing zone, into the heart of the ambush, into a place where every hostile fighter in the area was concentrating their fire. The helicopter descended steadily, Sarah's hands rock steady on the controls, her years of experience manifesting as absolute calm in the face of absolute danger. Enemy fire intensified as she descended. An RPG streaked past, so close she felt the heat bloom across the windscreen. Another round punched through the fuselage closer to the cockpit, but still she descended, still she pushed forward, still she drove the damaged Black Hawk downward into the zone where she was needed most. "Landing zone clear," Rodriguez's voice came through. "You are clear to land Black Hawk 5. All opposition fire is suppressed. Come on down." Sarah flared the helicopter, bleeding off speed, bringing the aircraft into hover just above the compound ground. The Rangers were already moving, carrying the wounded, preparing for extraction, ready to grab this chance at survival before the enemy regrouped and resumed their assault. She had made it. Against protocol, against orders, against probability, she had made it to the landing zone alive. Now came the most dangerous part of all, the extraction. The moment the Black Hawk settled into hover, everything became urgency crystallized into motion. The Rangers didn't waste a second. Specialist Dakota Cross and Corporal Kevin Walsh had been designated as the extraction team, and they moved with the kind of purpose that came from training, repeated 10,000 times. The rope rappels deployed, the thick nylon lines dropping from the aircraft like lifelines from heaven. Cross and Walsh were down in seconds, their boots hitting the compound ground hard and immediate, weapons at ready, eyes scanning for threats. Sarah held the helicopter steady. This was the most vulnerable moment, hovering motionless while every opposition fighter within range tried to shoot her from the sky. The aircraft absorbed impacts. A round punched through the cargo area, another sparked off the landing skid. Her door gunner, Sergeant Rivera, was maintaining disciplined suppressive fire, his machine gun hammering in controlled bursts, not one wasted round. Every bullet placed to suppress enemy movement, to keep heads down, to provide the window of time that extraction required. Rodriguez was moving now, carrying Private Morrison. The young soldier from Kentucky was conscious but barely, his face pale from blood loss, his uniform dark with the evidence of trauma. Rodriguez practically dragged him to the rope rappel, shouting encouragement that Morrison probably couldn't hear through the pain and shock. Cross met them halfway, grabbing Morrison, helping him toward the ascending rope. Morrison's hands found the rope, and he began climbing, each movement obviously agonizing, each pull upward a victory against shock and gravity. "Come on, Morrison, you're almost there." Someone was shouting, and Sarah realized it was Rivera, still maintaining fire but watching the extraction, his eyes tracking the wounded soldier climbing toward the helicopter. Morrison reached the aircraft hatch, and hands, so many hands, reached down to grab him, to pull him aboard, to drag him into the relative safety of the fuselage. But Morrison was only part of the equation. Specialist Sarah Wu required different extraction. She couldn't climb. The internal bleeding Captain Hayes suspected meant movement that was too aggressive could cause catastrophic hemorrhage. So instead, Cross and Walsh were rigging a stretcher, an improvised assembly of canvas and rope designed to carry the critically wounded upward by force of pulleys and determination. Wu was loaded onto the stretcher, her eyes half closed, her breathing shallow. Captain Hayes was beside her, maintaining pressure on the wound site, whispering encouragement that seemed almost obscene in its optimism. The stretcher was hooked to the extraction line. "Coming up," someone shouted, and the mechanical winch began its work, drawing Wu upward through the night. Enemy fire was concentrating now, the opposition fighters recognizing what was happening, understanding that they were losing their prisoners, losing their opportunity for negotiations or intelligence. The intensity increased, more rounds, more focused fire, more coordinated suppression. One round came so close to Sarah's windscreen that she felt the concussive wave. Her hands tightened on the controls, maintaining absolute hover despite the helicopter being hammered by incoming fire. Wu reached the helicopter hatch. She was barely conscious, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. Hands grabbed her, pulled her inboard, and Rivera was calling out, 30 seconds. We've got 30 seconds before enemy repositions. The statement was a combination of warning and urgency, a way of communicating that the window was closing fast. Rodriguez was shouting orders now, his voice cutting through the chaos. "All positions, tighten perimeter. We're bringing everyone in." Soldiers were consolidating, creating a shrinking defensive circle around the helicopter, their muzzle flashes creating a strobe effect in the darkness. The Rangers were going to extract more than just the critical wounded. They were attempting something insane, bringing additional soldiers aboard, fitting as many bodies as possible onto the helicopter. 6 Rangers climbed the rope rappels simultaneously, their movements rapid and desperate. Cross and Walsh were helping them, boosting them upward, trying to move the process faster. Sarah watched the helicopter's weight indicator begin to rise, the aircraft settling slightly lower, the engine strain increasing audibly. She was pushing the damaged aircraft beyond its rated carrying capacity, but stopping wasn't an option. "We're at max capacity," Tom called out. "Any more and we'll exceed weight limits." "Get Rodriguez aboard," Sarah responded. "That's an order." Rodriguez was moving toward the rope now, the last Ranger on the ground, his position at the extraction point symbolic of his command, always last to leave. An RPG streaked past, so close the warhead's backblast rattled the helicopter. Sarah felt the aircraft shudder, felt the engine strain, felt the terrible realization that she was asking machines designed for specific parameters to function far beyond their limits. Rodriguez reached the rope. His hands found the line and he began climbing, no longer young enough for easy ascension, but driven by something deeper than youth, the desperate certainty that every second of delay meant potential catastrophe. An enemy round caught him in the shoulder as he climbed. Sarah saw him flinch, saw the ripple of pain cross his face, but his hands never faltered. He was 1 meter from the hatch, then 2, then. Walsh grabbed him, pulled him into the aircraft with strength born from adrenaline and desperation. "All clear," Rivera shouted. "Everyone's aboard." Sarah pulled up hard on the collective. The Black Hawk lurched upward, its engine screaming in protest, the helicopter climbing away from the killing zone with all the urgency its damaged systems could muster. Enemy fire continued, rounds pursuing them upward, some connecting with the fuselage, but the angle was becoming more difficult, the range extending, the probability of additional hits decreasing with each meter of altitude gained. "Clear of the LZ," Tom reported. "We're climbing away clean." But Sarah wasn't celebrating. One of her engines had taken damage earlier, and now she was pushing both engines to absolute maximum output. The left engine was beginning to show signs of stress, the fuel flow gauge fluctuating, the temperature climbing. She eased off slightly on the power, trying to find the balance between sufficient altitude and engine preservation. Behind her, the Rangers were collapsing into seats, into the floor, into any available space. Rodriguez was pressing his hand to his shoulder where the round had caught him, his expression showing surprise that he'd been hit. Morrison was barely conscious but alive, and Wu was receiving immediate medical attention from Captain Hayes. The stretcher was being secured, the secured arms forming a makeshift medical platform in the cargo area. "How many did we get?" Sarah asked, not taking her eyes off the instruments. "All 320, Tom responded, his voice carrying something that might have been awe. "Every single Ranger that went in, all of them coming out." Sarah felt something release in her chest. They had done it. Against protocol, against orders, against probability, they had extracted everyone. The damaged left engine continued to labor, the aircraft settling into a stable climb at reduced power output. She banked toward the base, toward home, toward the moment when this gamble would either be viewed as heroism or insubordination. For now, it was simply survival. The landing was controlled chaos. Sarah brought the damaged Black Hawk down at 22:47 hours, approximately 2 hours and 5 minutes after the first distress call, though it felt like both an instant and an eternity. The aircraft touched down with surprising gentleness given its condition, the damaged engine still laboring, the fuselage bearing witness to the violence it had endured. Medical personnel were waiting. They'd been standing by since the first reports of wounded, and they flooded toward the helicopter with stretchers, with equipment, with the focused intensity of people trained for exactly this scenario. But before the medical team could reach the helicopter, military police appeared, not in response to the wounded soldiers needing care, but in response to something far more complicated. Captain Sarah Mitchell had violated direct orders. Captain Sarah Mitchell had conducted an unauthorized flight. Captain Sarah Mitchell had endangered a multi-million-dollar aircraft. These facts were as real as the 320 Rangers who were now alive, stepping carefully from the aircraft, their faces carrying the expression of people who had stepped back from the edge of annihilation. Sarah shut down the engines and removed her flight helmet. She could see the military police moving toward her, could see the formality of their approach, the official nature of what was about to happen. She unbuckled her harness and climbed down from the cockpit, her legs unsteady after the adrenaline crash, her mind already processing what came next. "Captain Mitchell," the senior military police officer said formally, "you are being detained pending investigation into violation of direct orders and unauthorized aircraft operation. Please come with me." Sarah didn't resist. She walked with the military police, leaving her aircraft, leaving her crew, walking toward whatever consequences her choices had earned. She could hear the Rangers calling out, could hear their voices trying to reach her. "Captain, thank you. You saved us." But she kept walking, kept her expression neutral, kept her focus on what had to happen next. The investigation began immediately. A formal hearing was convened, with senior officers assembled in a room that suddenly felt very small and very official. The charges were clear: violation of direct orders from a superior officer, unauthorized aircraft operation in a combat zone, endangerment of military equipment and personnel. Each charge carried potential consequences ranging from administrative action to court-martial. Sarah sat in a chair facing a panel of officers, and she waited for her fate to be determined. Then Rodriguez walked in, and everything changed. "I would like to make a statement," Captain James Rodriguez said to the hearing panel, his shoulder bandaged where the enemy round had caught him. His voice carried authority, and more than that, it carried moral weight that transcended military hierarchy. "Captain Sarah Mitchell saved every single one of my soldiers, every single one. What followed was testimony that would later become legend. Rodriguez described the ambush, the overwhelming enemy force, the ammunition running out, the moment when protocol dictated that they would die in that compound. He described the sound of Sarah's helicopter, the impossible descent through enemy fire, the extraction that should never have succeeded. Then Chen stepped forward. Private Marcus Chen, who had survived the night, who had climbed aboard that helicopter, who was now breathing air that protocol had deemed acceptable to lose. He talked about his newborn daughter, about the fact that he would get to hold her because Sarah Mitchell had made a choice that transcended authority. One by one, the Rangers testified. Specialist Wu, whose internal bleeding was stabilized by Captain Hayes' field medicine, spoke through her pain about waking up in the helicopter and realizing she was going to live. Private Morrison, the young soldier from Kentucky, talked about coming home to his family. Dozens of Rangers testified, each one describing the same thing. They were alive because Sarah Mitchell had ignored orders. The hearing panel's expressions changed as the testimony accumulated. These were career officers, men and women who understood the importance of protocol, who had spent decades enforcing the chain of command. But they were also soldiers, and they understood something deeper, that sometimes protocol was designed for normal situations, and this situation had been anything but normal. The military prosecutor argued the case. Regardless of the outcome, Captain Mitchell violated explicit orders. She endangered a military asset. She created confusion in the command structure during an active operation. These facts don't change regardless of success. It was a technically accurate argument, and it completely missed the point. Colonel Harrison stood to address the panel. I gave Captain Mitchell the order to hold position. I knew what that order meant. I knew it was likely to result in casualties. I also knew that sending unauthorized aircraft into an active ambush was dangerous and could result in friendly fire incidents or additional losses. He paused, his jaw tightening. But Captain Mitchell understood something I was trying to avoid. Sometimes following protocol means accepting unacceptable losses. She chose to accept the consequences of breaking protocol rather than accepting those losses. I respect that choice more than I respect my own orders. The panel deliberated for 4 hours. When they reconvened, their decision was both surprising and inevitable. Captain Mitchell, the senior officer announced, you have violated direct orders. That violation cannot be overlooked, and it has been recorded in your official file. However, this hearing also recognizes that your actions, while insubordinate, resulted in the preservation of 320 lives and no additional casualties beyond those already sustained before your arrival. He paused, and Sarah could see something in his expression shift, a recognition of something beyond protocol. Your actions, while violations of military conduct, demonstrated exceptional judgment in a situation where following protocol would have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. This hearing recommends that your administrative consequences be limited to a formal reprimand and a mandatory review of command protocols regarding pilot discretion in life-or-death situations. The decision meant career consequences for Sarah. The reprimand would follow her, might limit certain advancement opportunities, represented official acknowledgement that she had broken the rules. But it also meant no court-martial, no prison, no permanent destruction of her career. It meant that the Army had found a way to punish her while simultaneously acknowledging that she had done something that needed to be done. What happened next wasn't in the official record, but it happened anyway. The 320 Rangers still at the base, still processing what they had survived, assembled outside the hearing room. When Sarah walked out, they were waiting, and they stood, all 320 of them, in silent acknowledgement of what she had done. Rodriguez approached her, his shoulder still bandaged, his face carrying the weight of command balanced against gratitude. He didn't say anything. He simply extended his hand and Sarah shook it. Behind him, Chen was holding a photograph, the picture of his newborn daughter. He showed it to Sarah and said simply, This exists because of you. Years later, the incident would become the foundation for revised military protocols. Pilots would be granted specific discretion in life-or-death situations where protocol conflicted with the preservation of life. The concept of ethical command deviation, the understanding that sometimes following orders meant accepting unacceptable outcomes, would reshape military leadership training. But for Sarah, what mattered most was simpler. Every one of those 320 Rangers went home to their families. Rodriguez made it home to his wife. Chen met his daughter properly. Morrison reunited with his family. Wu recovered from her injuries and continued her service. And somewhere in the records of the United States Army, in a file that carried the name Captain Sarah Mitchell, there was a note that she had once chosen conscience over obedience, and that choice had saved 320 lives. She had paid the price for that choice. But looking at the Rangers standing before her, knowing they would go home, knowing they would live their lives, she would pay that price again every time without hesitation.